In the summer of 1990, a decorated police sergeant walked out of his station for what should have been just another night on duty. But he never came home. Hours later, his patrol car was found abandoned. Engine still running, radio crackling, but the sergeant was gone. For years, rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed he snapped and ran away. Others whispered that he knew too much, and someone wanted him silenced. Then, 10 years later, a farmer turned over a shovel of dirt and uncovered something no one was prepared for: a shredded police uniform, still holding the sergeant's badge. And that single discovery would tear open a truth darker than anyone imagined. A truth buried not by criminals, but possibly by his own brothers in blue. What really happened to the sergeant that night? Who wanted him gone? And why did it take a decade for the truth to crawl back to the surface? Stick with me, because this story will change the way you think about trust, loyalty, and justice. And before we dive in, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and have you ever heard of a case like this? In 1990, Sergeant Daniel Cross was one of the most respected officers in his small town. He wasn't the kind of cop people feared. He was the kind of cop people waved at, the one kids ran up to at the diner just to see his badge. He had been on the force for over 15 years. He knew every street, every shop, and almost every person by name. Daniel was tough on crime but fair. If a teenager was caught stealing, he would lecture them but then walk them home instead of dragging them to jail. His fellow officers admired him. He had a calm presence. He didn't lose his temper. When younger cops panicked, he stepped in and steadied the situation. At home, he was just as steady. His wife, Linda, often told friends she felt safe no matter what because Daniel was her husband. They had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both in middle school. Daniel made time for them, even when work pulled him in 100 directions. He showed up for school plays, coached Little League, and still managed to take late-night calls from the station. Everyone believed Daniel Cross was unshakable. He was the type of man who could be counted on. His word was his bond. He wore his uniform with pride, but he wasn't just a cop. He was a father, a husband, and a neighbor. That is why what happened next shocked everyone. When a man like Sergeant Cross suddenly disappears, it doesn't just raise suspicion. It tears apart everything people thought they knew about him and about their town. It was a warm night in late summer when Sergeant Cross walked into the station for his evening shift. Nothing seemed unusual. He grabbed a cup of coffee from the machine, the same bitter brew he complained about every night. He chatted with 2 younger officers about a recent football game. They laughed, joked, and teased each other like always. At roll call, the captain gave out assignments. Cross was assigned routine patrol on the south side of town, an area he knew better than anyone. He jotted notes on his clipboard, nodded, and went back to sipping his coffee. One officer later said Cross looked tired, but not more than usual. Another said he looked focused, like he had something on his mind. But no one saw anything that set off alarms. Before heading out, he checked his gear: radio, sidearm, flashlight, everything in place. He gave a quick wave to his fellow officers and walked toward his patrol car. It was just another night, another shift. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Within hours, Daniel Cross would vanish without a trace. It was supposed to be another quiet night, but just after midnight, a passing driver noticed something strange on the side of the road. A patrol car was sitting there, engine still running, headlights cutting across the empty highway. At first, the driver thought maybe the officer had pulled someone over, but as he slowed down, he realized something was wrong. The squad car was empty. The driver's door hung wide open. The radio crackled faintly inside, but no one answered. Soon, backup officers arrived. They stepped out, flashlights sweeping across the scene. The ground was still damp from a light rain. Gravel crunched under their boots as they approached the vehicle. The sight inside made their stomachs sink. The driver's seat was pushed back, the keys still in the ignition. But the sergeant's service pistol was missing. So was his radio. They searched the area, calling out his name into the darkness. Nothing. The night was silent, except for the hum of the patrol car's engine. One officer checked the trunk, half expecting to find something, anything. It was empty. Another walked into the weeds along the shoulder, scanning for footprints. There were a few impressions in the mud, but the rain had already begun to wash them away. The more they searched, the colder the scene felt. This wasn't just a quick stop gone wrong. It was as if the sergeant had vanished in the middle of duty, leaving no trace but his car. Word spread quickly. Officers whispered among themselves, unsettled. A man as reliable as him would never just leave his post. By dawn, the roadside was covered with police tape. Flashing red and blue lights painted the darkness. The sergeant's empty patrol car had become the center of a mystery, one that no one on the force could explain. At home, the sergeant's wife sat in the living room, waiting for him to return. He was never late. Every night she heard the sound of his boots on the porch, the door creaking open and his soft voice saying he was home. Tonight, the silence stretched on too long. The phone rang. It was a call no family ever wants to receive. The department told her his car had been found empty, and no one knew where he was. Her heart dropped. She could barely hold the phone steady. She asked over and over, "What do you mean you do know where he is?" But no one had an answer. The children woke up to the sound of her crying. They stood in the hallway, confused and scared. She tried to stay calm for them, but the tears kept coming. By the next morning, neighbors had gathered outside. Friends brought food, tried to comfort the family, but nothing eased the dread. Every knock on the door made her jump. Every ringing phone sent a wave of fear through her chest. The sergeant had promised he'd always come home. Now, his family was trapped in a nightmare, with only questions and no sign of him anywhere. Within hours of finding the empty patrol car, the department launched a full search. Patrol officers, detectives, and volunteers flooded the area. The roadside where his car sat became the command post. Flashing lights lit up the night, and the quiet fields nearby turned into a hive of frantic activity. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights sweeping across fields and tree lines. On the ground, officers moved in rows, calling out his name again and again. Dogs barked as handlers guided them through thick brush, hopping to pick up his scent. Neighbors and strangers joined in, carrying flashlights, some with lanterns, all determined to help. They combed through ditches, walked along fence lines, and checked barns and sheds. Every few minutes, someone thought they saw or heard something. A flashlight beam caught movement. A voice shouted in the distance. But each time it ended in disappointment. The search stretched into the early hours of the morning. Volunteers shivered in the cold, but no one wanted to stop. The sergeant wasn't just another officer. He was one of their own. By dawn, police extended the search even further. Boats were sent into nearby rivers. Dive teams scanned the water. Every lead turned up empty. His family waited at the edge of the scene, praying for good news. But as the hours dragged on, their hope began to sink. The only thing found was silence. By the end of the second day, exhaustion had set in. Officers who had known the sergeant for years now stared at each other with hollow eyes. They had searched every field, every stretch of road, and every body of water they could reach. But the man they were looking for, one of the most trusted in their ranks, was nowhere to be found. By the third day, whispers began to spread through the town. At the diner, at the gas station, in line at the grocery store, everyone had a theory. Some said the sergeant had finally cracked under the pressure. Maybe he had just driven away, leaving his life behind. Others shook their heads at that idea. They believed he had been ambushed, maybe by criminals he had arrested in the past. But then came darker whispers, ones that struck at the heart of the department. Some townspeople wondered aloud if his disappearance had something to do with the badge itself. Could someone from the inside know more than they were saying? The longer he stayed missing, the worse the rumors grew. Neighbors who once trusted each other now looked with suspicion. Some believed the police weren't telling the full story. Others thought the family knew something they weren't sharing. The town was splitting apart. Trust was crumbling and fear was spreading. What had started as a mystery was now turning into something far bigger, something that threatened to tear the community in two. Back at the sergeant's home, the silence was crushing. The kitchen table still held his coffee mug from the morning he left. His jacket still hung by the door. It was as if he had just stepped out for a moment, except he hadn't come back. His wife sat in the living room, staring at the police uniform that hung neatly in the hallway closet. She couldn't bring herself to move it. That uniform had always been a symbol of safety and pride. Now, it felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. The phone kept ringing, neighbors, relatives, reporters, but she ignored most of the calls. Every time she picked it up, the words felt harder to repeat. He's missing. They don't know what happened. The children didn't understand. His son asked when Dad was coming home. His daughter clutched a small toy he had given her, refusing to let it go. Each night, they begged their mother for answers, but she had none. She tried to reassure them, but the look in her eyes betrayed the truth. She was just as lost as they were. Friends stopped by with food and words of comfort. Some prayed with her. Some promised the police would find him. But behind every hug and whispered reassurance, she could see the same fear. What if he never came back? At night, when the kids finally fell asleep, she sat alone in the dark. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. She would stare at the empty chair where he always sat after work. She remembered his laugh, the way he carried himself with confidence, the way he always promised he'd be home safe. Now, even those memories felt fragile. Each day that passed with no news deepened the family's pain. Birthdays came and went. Holidays arrived with an empty seat at the table. The uniform stayed where it was, untouched, as if moving it would mean admitting the truth, that he was gone. Her heart carried two battles at once. Part of her still held on to hope. Maybe he was alive somewhere, maybe he would walk through the door again. But the other part, the heavier part, feared the worst. She wondered if he had been hurt, if someone had silenced him, if the uniform at home was the last trace of the man she loved. The children grew quieter as the weeks turned into months. Questions became whispers, and whispers became silence. They learned, far too young, how to live with unanswered prayers. The sergeant's family had lost more than a husband and father. They had lost the anchor that held them steady. And as the community whispered theories and the police searched for answers, the family sat in their home, staring at the uniform that hung in the closet, waiting for a truth that refused to come. The mystery of what happened to the man they loved was only just beginning. The morning after the sergeant vanished, detectives launched a massive hunt. His squad car gave them a starting point, but no answers. They called in every resource they had. Divers dragged the river near where his car was found. Boats moved slowly across the dark water, dropping hooks and nets. Each time they pulled something up, hearts raced. But every time it was nothing, just branches, rocks, or trash. In the woods, search teams moved in long lines. Officers, volunteers, and dogs covered mile after mile. Flashlights cut through the trees at night. Helicopters hovered overhead, their spotlights sweeping the ground. People shouted his name, hoping he'd answer. The silence was heavy. Detectives checked abandoned houses and empty barns. They kicked open doors, climbed into attics, and searched basements. They looked for any sign, footprints, clothing, blood. But each building told the same story. Nothing. Every new lead sparked hope. A shoeprint in the mud, a noise in the woods, a report of someone seen walking late at night. Investigators chased them all. And every time the lead collapsed. Days turned into weeks. The search kept expanding. More rivers, more fields, more towns. But the bigger it grew, the less sense it made. It was as if the sergeant had been erased. Detectives began to feel the pressure. Reporters demanded updates. The family begged for answers. And the town whispered, how can a man vanish like this with no trace at all? The wider they searched, the deeper the mystery became. As weeks passed, people started coming forward with stories. At first, detectives felt a surge of hope. Maybe someone had finally seen something that explained the mystery. But the stories didn't fit together. One man swore he saw the sergeant in a car late that night, driving fast down a back road. He claimed there were other men in the car with him. When asked for details, what the men looked like, what kind of car it was, his answers kept changing. Another witness said something very different. She told police she saw the sergeant walking alone near the highway, looking upset. She said he kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone was following him. But when detectives asked about the time and direction, her story shifted. A third person said they heard shouting in the woods, followed by silence. But no one else heard it, and searches of the area found nothing. Every statement contradicted the others. Detectives tried to piece them together, but the puzzle only grew more confusing. Was he in a car? Was he on foot? Was he meeting someone or running from someone? The more people talked, the less anyone believed them. Some thought witnesses were making it up for attention. Others thought fear had clouded their memories. Inside the department, frustration boiled over. Detectives argued about which stories to believe. Time was slipping away, and still no solid evidence had appeared. Instead of solving the mystery, the witnesses only made it darker. Detectives turned to the patrol car, hoping it would hold answers. The vehicle was still idling when it was found. Surely, it had to contain clues. Forensic teams combed every inch. They dusted for fingerprints on the doors, the steering wheel, even the trunk. The results came back muddy. Too many smudges, nothing clear enough to prove who touched it last. They searched the ground around the car. Footprints were found in the dirt, but rain had blurred them. Some looked like boots, others like sneakers. None could be matched to the sergeant or anyone else. Tire tracks were photographed and measured. At first, investigators thought they belonged to another vehicle that had stopped near the patrol car, but analysis showed they could have come from almost any truck on the road. No match. They checked the radio, hoping for a last transmission. Static. No messages. His gun was gone, but there were no shell casings, no signs of a struggle. Every test, every lead, every tiny piece of evidence dissolved into nothing. The car, once believed to be the key, gave them zero answers. For detectives, it was like chasing shadows. The deeper they dug, the more the case resisted them. As weeks passed with no progress, the department began to crack. Behind closed doors, tempers flared. Some officers whispered that the sergeant had simply run away. They pointed to the missing gun and radio. Maybe he staged it, they said. Maybe he wanted to disappear. Others strongly disagreed. They believed something terrible had happened, that he was ambushed or betrayed. They demanded more resources, more pressure, more answers. Meetings turned heated. Detectives argued about leads, priorities, even motives. Instead of working as one, the team split into camps. The tension spread beyond the walls of the station. Whispers turned into open accusations. Some claimed fellow officers knew more than they were admitting. Others suggested corruption, secrets being covered up. The chief tried to calm the storm, but trust was already breaking. A case that was supposed to unite the department had instead driven it apart. While the public demanded answers, the officers charged with finding them were busy fighting each other. And with every clash inside the department, the chance of solving the mystery grew smaller. The disappearance of one man had become a shadow over them all. As the investigation dragged on, new whispers began to spread. People in town started asking the questions no one wanted to say out loud. What if the sergeant hadn't been taken by strangers at all? What if the threat came from inside the department itself? Rumors surfaced that, before he vanished, the sergeant had been asking tough questions. Some said he was digging into missing evidence. Others claimed he was investigating officers with ties to criminals. Nothing was proven, but the rumors spread quickly. In private, even some detectives admitted the possibility. If he had discovered corruption, that would make him a target. Who else had access to his route? Who else knew his schedule that night? Only people inside the department. The thought was chilling. Could his own brothers in uniform have silenced him? Officials denied it. The department released statements promising their full commitment to the case. But the community wasn't convinced. Every dead lead made the rumors louder. For the sergeant's family, these whispers cut deepest. To think the man who believed in justice could have been betrayed by his own force was almost too much to bear. The shadow of betrayal crept in, and it never left. Time moved on, but answers never came. Months slipped into years. The search team stopped going out. The helicopters no longer circled the rivers or woods. What was once an urgent manhunt slowly became an unsolved file in a drawer. New crimes filled the headlines. Reporters moved on to fresher stories. The sergeant's case was mentioned less and less, until it became a ghost story people whispered about late at night. For his family, though, the silence was unbearable. Birthdays passed without him. Holidays came with an empty chair. His wife clung to hope, but even that hope thinned with time. By the late 1990s, the case was officially cold. No new evidence, no new witnesses, no progress. The silence was louder than the search had ever been. For the sergeant's wife, the hardest part wasn't just that he was gone. It was the feeling of being abandoned by the very system that promised to find him. At first, officers checked in often, sharing updates, asking questions. But as months turned into years, those visits grew fewer. Soon, there were no calls at all. The silence was louder than any words. She felt forgotten, left to carry the weight alone. Her children grew up under that shadow. At school, whispers followed them. Classmates asked cruel questions. Did your dad run away? Did he get killed by bad guys? Did the police do it? The kids had no answers. They learned to keep their pain quiet, to bury it deep. Inside their home, the family lived with constant reminders. The empty chair at the table, the untouched uniform still hanging in the closet, the badge in a small box by the bed. Each piece was both memory and wound. The wife often lay awake at night, wondering if she had failed him, or if the department had failed them all. No matter where the blame truly belonged, the result was the same. Her children were growing up without a father, and the town seemed ready to move on. For the family, the mystery never faded. It only deepened with time. By the mid-1990s, with no answers in sight, the town turned to rumors. Some people began to believe the sergeant hadn't been taken at all. They said he had planned his disappearance. The theory spread fast. Neighbors whispered that maybe he had grown tired of the pressure. He worked long hours, faced danger daily, and carried the weight of responsibility. What if he had decided one night to simply walk away? Some claimed he had a secret life. Stories appeared in local papers saying he might have had money troubles or even a second family somewhere far away. Others said he wanted freedom from the badge, from the stress, from everything. The missing gun and radio only added fuel. Maybe, people suggested, he had staged the scene to make it look like a crime. The open car door, the running engine, it could have been his way of leaving without a trace. But to his wife and children, those whispers felt like betrayal. They knew the man behind the uniform. He loved his job, but he loved his family more. He would never abandon them. Still, the theory stuck, and with each passing year, more people believed it. The whispers of escape became one of the strongest and cruelest suspicions of all. Not everyone believed the escape theory. Others were certain the sergeant had been hunted. He had put dozens of dangerous criminals behind bars during his career, drug dealers, thieves, and violent offenders. Any one of them could have wanted revenge. Detectives revisited his old cases. They pulled dusty files, read transcripts, and tracked down men who had once sworn to kill him. Some of those criminals were still locked up, but others had been released. The timing was suspicious. One man had told a cellmate years earlier that the sergeant would pay one day. Another was rumored to have been in the area the week he vanished. But when investigators checked, nothing solid connected them. No evidence, no eyewitnesses, no confessions. Still, the idea stuck in the town's mind. People whispered that maybe he had been ambushed on patrol. Maybe his enemies had caught him alone and exacted their revenge. The theory made sense to many, far more than the idea that he had run away. But without proof, it was just another story in a growing list of maybes. The past had enemies, but the truth was still buried. The boldest theory wasn't about escape or old criminals. It was darker. It pointed inward, at the very people the sergeant had once worked beside. At first, the idea seemed impossible. How could fellow officers, men and women sworn to protect, turn on one of their own? But as the years dragged on without answers, whispers grew louder. People in town said, what if he knew something he wasn't supposed to know? What if someone in uniform made sure he never spoke again? The department pushed back hard. They denied it, saying the idea was insulting and baseless. But denial didn't stop the rumors. Locals remembered the conflicts inside the force before the sergeant vanished, the arguments, the split loyalties, the distrust. To many, it suddenly made sense. Trust began to crack. People who once waved at patrol cars now avoided them. Some families told their kids, Don't talk to the police. They can't even be trusted with their own. Inside the department, morale collapsed. Officers felt targeted, watched, and judged. Every move they made drew suspicion. "We didn't do this," they said again and again, but it didn't matter. The theory had taken root. What if the greatest threat hadn't come from the outside, but from within? While the community fought over theories, the sergeant's wife carried a different kind of burden. She had lost her husband, but she hadn't lost the spotlight. Reporters camped outside her door. Neighbors asked the same painful question over and over. "What do you think really happened?" Some pressed harder. "Did he ever talk about leaving? Did he have enemies? Was he hiding something from you?" At first she tried to answer, but every word she said got twisted, printed in headlines and thrown back at her. If she showed doubt, people claimed she suspected corruption. If she defended her husband, others said she was covering for him. She couldn't win. The loneliness grew worse at home. Her children, still young, asked where their father had gone. In school, they heard cruel whispers, rumors that their dad had run away, or worse, that he was killed by his own brothers in blue. The wife stood in the middle of it all, exhausted and grieving. She had no answers for her kids, no peace from the community, and no comfort from the department that once felt like family. Every day, the silence around her husband's case screamed louder. For the sergeant's children, growing up meant growing up in the shadow of a ghost. Their father's absence wasn't just inside their home. It followed them into every classroom, every playground, every street corner in town. At school, kids whispered when they walked by. "That's the family," some would say. Others teased cruelly, claiming their dad had run away or done something terrible. Teachers tried to quiet it, but the rumors never stopped. At birthday parties, the question still came. "Where's your dad? What really happened to him?" The children learned how to smile and change the subject, even while the sting remained. As they grew older, the whispers didn't fade. They simply grew sharper. Teenagers questioned them more directly. "Do you think he's alive? Do you think the cops did it?" Every opinion thrown at them was a reminder. Their father's mystery was now part of their identity. At home, they clung to their mother, who tried to shield them, but she couldn't erase the town's memory. Their father's name had become a wound, and for his children, it never healed. They weren't just kids anymore. They were the sergeant's kids, and the shadow of his disappearance would never let them go. As the years dragged on, the media refused to let the story die. Local newspapers printed updates every anniversary. National outlets picked up the case, running bold headlines that drew both sympathy and suspicion. TV crews arrived in town with cameras, interviewing neighbors and retired officers. They painted dramatic pictures. Some called it a mystery, others called it a scandal. Each angle only stirred more division. Then came the conspiracy theories. Radio hosts and tabloid writers claimed the sergeant had faked his death. Others swore he had been silenced by a ring of corrupt cops. A few even suggested something supernatural, that he had vanished into thin air. The internet only made it worse. Forums filled with arguments, strangers debating the case as if it were a puzzle to solve. "I think he's alive. I think the department buried it. I think the family knows more than they say." The sergeant's name became less about the man and more about the mystery. He was no longer remembered for the cases he solved or the uniform he wore. He was a headline, a question mark, a symbol of uncertainty. For his family, it was agony. Every article, every broadcast, every theory reopened the wound. The truth was still missing, but the noise around it had only grown louder. By the late 1990s, the case had become little more than a stack of dusty folders. Detectives who once promised answers had either retired, transferred, or simply given up. New cases took priority. Fresh crimes demanded attention. The missing sergeant's file was pushed further back, until one day it was quietly boxed up. The decision wasn't announced with fanfare. There was no press conference, no final statement to the family, just silence. The case was closed, not because it was solved, but because it had gone cold. Leads had dried up. Evidence had gone stale. For the department, it was a way of moving on, but for the family, it was something far darker. It felt like betrayal. His wife, who had waited years for a knock at the door with news, now had to face a different truth. No one was looking anymore. The children, now older, saw the box as a symbol. Their father's story, reduced to paperwork, sealed away in a filing cabinet. They wondered if anyone besides them even remembered his face. Hope didn't vanish in one moment. It faded slowly, like a light dimming. Each year, each unanswered question, each unopened box in storage chipped away at their belief. By the late 90s, the mystery was no longer just about where he went. It was about how easily a man's life, his service, his family, his name, could be forgotten. The sun had just started to rise when a farmer climbed onto his old tractor. It was the same routine he'd followed for years. Coffee in hand, he drove out into the wide, open field. Rows of crops stretched in every direction. The air was cool, the ground dry. To him, nothing about this day felt different. He had plowed this same land season after season. He knew every corner, every dip in the soil. It was work, but it was familiar work. Steady, quiet, dependable. The tractor rumbled along as the plow dug into the dirt, cutting neat lines through the earth. Birds scattered in the distance, and the only sounds were the engine's hum and the steady scrape of metal on soil. His mind drifted as it often did, thinking about chores waiting back at the house, about repairs that needed doing on the barn. Nothing seemed out of place. This was life on the farm, slow, steady, predictable. But sometimes, even in the most ordinary moments, something unexpected hides just below the surface. For this farmer, it was only a matter of minutes before his morning turned into something unforgettable, something that would drag the past into the present. The tractor moved forward, cutting through another stretch of dirt. Then it happened. A sharp clang echoed from beneath the plow, loud enough to jolt the farmer upright. The machine shuddered as if it had hit something solid. At first, he thought it was nothing unusual. This land had rocks buried deep, and every farmer knew the sudden shock of steel against stone. He stopped the tractor and looked back. Dust swirled in the morning air, settling over the furrows he'd just carved. He climbed down slowly, his boots crunching against the soil. Walking toward the spot, he expected to see a chunk of rock sticking out, maybe an old piece of rusted metal left behind from decades ago. Farmers often dug up strange scraps, tools, cans, even broken fence posts. It was part of working old land. But when he brushed away the dirt with his boot, the shape didn't look like stone. The surface had a smoothness to it, a flat, weathered edge that didn't belong to nature. He crouched, ran his hand over it, and felt the cold touch of metal hidden in the ground. This wasn't a rock, this wasn't farm scrap, it was something else, something big. The farmer stood, his heart beating faster now. Whatever the plow had struck, it had been buried there for years. And as he looked at the soil packed tight around the strange object, one thought pressed into his mind. He had just uncovered something he was never supposed to find. The farmer crouched low and began to dig with his hands. At first, the soil came up in clumps, heavy and damp. He scraped away more, trying to get a better look at the strange object. That's when he saw something unexpected: fabric. It was tangled in the dirt, stiff and dark from years underground. He frowned, pulling at it gently. The cloth came up in pieces, tearing as he lifted. It didn't feel like trash. It felt too heavy, too structured. He turned one piece over in his hands. The soil cracked off, revealing stitching along the edge. This wasn't random cloth. It was made, sewn with care. Another tug revealed more, a sleeve maybe crushed flat from the weight of the earth. At first his mind tried to explain it away. Maybe it was old work clothes someone had buried. Farmers often tossed broken things into the ground long ago. But the deeper he pulled, the clearer it became. This wasn't just any fabric. The color was wrong for workwear. It was too dark, too heavy, too official. He stood for a moment, breathing hard, staring at the dirt-stained cloth in his hands. His heart pounded with unease. Whatever this was, it wasn't supposed to be here. The farmer knelt again, brushing back more soil from the fabric. His hands shook as he pulled a larger section free. It was torn and ruined, but it had shape. The outline was clear now, a uniform. His chest tightened as his eyes locked on something glinting faintly through the dirt. At first, he thought it was just metal scrap tangled in the cloth. But as he brushed the soil away, the truth hit him like a punch. A badge. It was pinned crookedly to what remained of the chest pocket. Rust ate across its surface, the shine long gone. But the shape, the design, it was unmistakable. He leaned closer, squinting in disbelief. The letters were worn but still readable. It was a police badge, and not just any badge. The farmer's breath caught in his throat. He could see the name etched faintly into the corroded metal, the very name the town hadn't spoken without a shiver in 10 years. The missing sergeant. The farmer stumbled back, staring at the uniform in the dirt. He had just unearthed the ghost of a man everyone thought was gone forever, and with it, he knew, trouble was about to come roaring back. Within an hour, the quiet farm was unrecognizable. Red and blue lights flashed against the endless rows of soil. Police cars lined the dirt road, and yellow tape stretched across the field. Detectives and crime scene techs moved with urgency, kneeling in the same spot where the farmer's plow had struck. Gloved hands sifted through the soil, pulling out more fragments. Pieces of fabric, stiff from years underground, were laid gently onto plastic sheets. Someone held up a cracked piece of leather, maybe from a duty belt, maybe from boots. The more they dug, the stranger it looked. This wasn't a random accident. The items weren't scattered or washed here by time. They were together, pressed into the earth with intent. Someone had buried them. One detective leaned close, brushing the dirt from the badge. He looked up at the others. Nobody had to say a word. The silence between them said it all. After 10 years, the sergeant had come back, not alive but in fragments. The farmer stood at the edge of the tape, pale and trembling. His ordinary morning had just turned into the biggest break the case had ever seen. The news spread before the sun even set. Radios buzzed, phones rang, and within hours the whole town knew. The missing sergeant, gone for 10 years, had been found. Not his body, not his bones, but his uniform, buried like a secret no one wanted uncovered. Neighbors gathered in diners, gas stations, front porches. People whispered the same questions. Who buried it? Why there? And what did it mean about the night he vanished? For the family, the discovery was like ripping open an old wound. His wife collapsed into tears when detectives told her. The children, older now, didn't know what to feel. Relief, horror. Both emotions slammed into them at once. The department faced the hardest questions of all. For years, they had promised answers but delivered none. Now, with this uniform in the ground, the case had come roaring back, and with it, suspicion. The town that had once moved on was suddenly pulled back into the nightmare, and nobody could escape it this time. The badge sat on the kitchen table, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. It looked harmless, like a dull piece of metal, but to his wife it was heavier than anything she had ever seen. She sat in silence, hands pressed over her face. The last time she saw that badge, it was shining on her husband's chest. Now, after 10 years, it had come back to her corroded, bent, and covered in soil. She couldn't stop the tears. It felt like proof of something she had feared but never said out loud. He hadn't walked away. Someone had taken him. Her children stood nearby, staring. They were older now, no longer the small kids who once asked when Dad was coming home. They looked at the badge like it was a ghost. For them, this was the first real sign their father had existed beyond memory. One of them whispered, "So he didn't leave us." His wife shook her head, choking back tears. No, he didn't. The room stayed quiet, but inside each of them something shifted. The mystery was no longer just a story people told. It was real, lying inside a plastic bag on their table. The past had come crashing back, and with it, the truth they couldn't run from anymore. The uniform, the badge, and every scrap of cloth were rushed into evidence labs. Specialists treated the items like treasure, laying them out under bright lights. Technicians brushed away dirt, sealed fibers, and clipped tiny samples into plastic vials. The first tests confirmed what many already believed. The uniform had been underground for about 10 years. Soil trapped in the seams matched the layers from the farmer's field. This was no recent planting. Someone buried it in 1990, right after the sergeant disappeared. Forensic experts studied the leather scraps. Some pieces were cracked beyond saving, but faint imprints suggested they had once been part of a duty belt. The belt had been cut, not broken, raising more questions. Detectives leaned over the reports, their hands gripping the edges of the table. For a decade, they had chased shadows. Now here was physical proof. The case was no longer just a story whispered in town. It was real, and it was back. One investigator said it out loud. "We're not chasing rumors anymore. Someone buried him, someone close." With that, the room fell into silence. Everyone knew this case had just regained life, and this time they couldn't afford to fail. Detectives pressed forward, but almost instantly they hit a brutal wall. The uniform was here, but the sergeant was. No bones, no teeth, no remains of any kind. At every briefing, the same question circled the room. Why bury the uniform but not the man? Some thought maybe his body had been moved after the fact, taken somewhere else to make sure it was never found. Others believed whoever did this wanted the uniform hidden, but not the body, like erasing his identity mattered more than erasing him. Investigators returned to the field, digging deeper, scanning with ground-penetrating radar. Nothing turned up. They searched nearby woods and rivers again, desperate for any clue. Still, the ground gave up no more secrets. For the family, this part hurt worst of all. The uniform proved he didn't run, but without a body, there was no grave to visit, no final answer to their pain. His children asked the same question detectives asked. Where is he? The puzzle was chilling. A man could not simply vanish, yet 10 years later, all that surfaced was his badge and torn clothing. It was a half-truth, and it only deepened the mystery. Detectives turned back to the witnesses from 1990. One by one, the same people were called again, this time into brighter rooms with sharper questions. An old neighbor swore she remembered seeing the sergeant's patrol car speed past her house that night. But now, 10 years later, her memory shifted. She wasn't sure if it was really him behind the wheel. Maybe it was someone else. A truck driver had once said he saw the sergeant walking along the road, looking distressed. But under new questioning, he admitted he had been tired that night. It could have been another man entirely. Other witnesses flat out changed their stories. One who once claimed he saw the sergeant with strangers now said he might have been pressured to speak up, just to feel important. The contradictions stacked higher than ever. Instead of clarity, the interviews gave detectives more fog. But one thing stood out. Several people mentioned officers being unusually tense in the days after the disappearance. Back then, it felt like nothing. Now it looked suspicious. The past was cracking open, but with it came new shadows. Everyone seemed to know something. Nobody seemed willing to tell the whole truth. In 1990, detectives had only fingerprints and blood typing. Now, in 2000, they had new tools: DNA testing, fiber analysis, and advanced soil comparison. Forensic experts re-examined the uniform with fresh eyes. They plucked tiny hairs from the collar, tested faint stains soaked deep in the cloth, and compared soil from the seams to different areas around town. The results painted a darker picture. Fibers showed violent tearing, the kind that suggested a struggle, not just wear and tear. A trace of blood, too degraded for a match, still hinted at injury. Soil from the uniform matched not just the farmer's field, but also a wooded property tied to someone close to the department. The findings were clear. The sergeant hadn't simply vanished into the night. Something violent had happened, and then someone buried the evidence. Detectives stared at the lab reports, the weight of it sinking in. For the first time, science was saying what the town had whispered for a decade. This was no disappearance. It was foul play. The discovery of the uniform sends shockwaves through the town. Local news stations run the story nonstop. Reporters stand outside the police department, shoving microphones at anyone walking in or out. Headlines read, "Sergeant's uniform found after 10 years, and did police fail one of their own?" Talk shows invite retired detectives to speculate. Some blame sloppy work from 1990. Others say the department wanted the case buried. On the streets, anger boils over. Candlelight vigils turn into protests. People hold signs that read, "Justice for the sergeant and do your job." Old friends of the missing man give interviews. They say the department didn't fight hard enough when he first vanished. Families of other victims come forward, saying their cases were also ignored. City leaders feel the heat. The mayor calls for a full review. The police chief promises no stone will be left unturned. But the words don't calm anyone. At town meetings, residents demand answers. Why did it take 10 years for evidence to surface? Who buried the uniform? Why wasn't the farmland searched back then? The sergeant's family sits front row during these meetings, their grief now mixed with anger. His wife's voice cracks as she says, "If this was one of you, it wouldn't have taken 10 years." News crews film every moment. The case is no longer just about a missing man. It has become a test of trust between the community and the police. For detectives, the pressure is unbearable. Every step, every word is under the spotlight. Mistakes from the past cannot be repeated. The case must break open before the public's patience snaps completely. Detectives return to the families, both of the missing sergeant and the original suspects. For the sergeant's relatives, the questions cut deep. His children, now young adults, sit across from investigators. They are asked about that night in 1990, what they remember, who their father was meeting. Each question feels like ripping open an old wound. His wife listens quietly, holding the badge found in the field. When detectives ask if she suspects anyone, her eyes fill with tears. "I don't know anymore," she whispers, "but someone out there does." Meanwhile, the families of former suspects face the same grilling. Men who were once cleared are called back in. Their wives and children, who thought the shadow of suspicion was gone, now feel it return. Neighbors whisper again. Old rumors resurface. At school, kids whose parents were suspects get teased. At work, coworkers glance sideways. For everyone involved, it feels like 1990 all over again, except now the spotlight is brighter, harsher. One mother of a former suspect begs detectives to stop dragging her family through the mud. "We've lived with this cloud for 10 years. How much longer?" Detectives don't answer. They can't. Because until the truth comes out, every family touched by this case is trapped in it, forced to relive the nightmare. In front of cameras, the sergeant's wife appears calm. She thanks the public for their support. She tells reporters she believes the police will find answers. Her voice is steady, her words careful. But behind closed doors, she is crumbling. Friends who visit her house find her packing, unable to sit still. Some nights she barely sleeps. She admits she dreads the phone ringing, terrified it will bring news she isn't ready to face. For 10 years, she held on to hope that her husband might still be alive somewhere. Maybe he was forced to leave. Maybe he couldn't return. But the discovery of his uniform shattered that fragile hope. Now darker thoughts creep in. What if the truth is worse than she ever imagined? What if his death was brutal? What if someone he trusted betrayed him? Her children notice the change. At dinner, she tries to smile, but her hands tremble as she passes food across the table. One night, her daughter asks, "Mom, do you think Dad suffered?" She has no answer. She excuses herself, locking the bathroom door so her children don't hear her sobbing. She feels torn in two, between being strong for her family in public and admitting the depth of her fear in private. For the community, she is a symbol of patience and courage. For detectives, she is a reminder of what's at stake. But in her own home, she is simply a woman on the edge, terrified the truth they uncover may not bring peace, only more pain. Detectives head into the storage rooms of the police department, where shelves are stacked with dusty boxes from the early 1990s. Most of the files haven't been touched in years. The air smells stale, the folders brittle with age. One detective opens a box marked "Missing Sergeant." Inside are handwritten logs, officer reports, and notes from the original investigation. At first, it looks routine, but as they dig deeper, odd details start to appear. One patrol log shows the sergeant was last seen leaving the station at 8:45 p.m. Another report claims it was closer to 10 p.m. The times don't match. Another file lists the names of officers who were supposed to be on duty that night, but at least 2 of those names later admit they weren't actually there. Their shifts had been switched, yet no one updated the official logs. Even stranger, a call sheet from dispatch is missing, a whole hour of records gone. Detectives flip through page after page, finding sloppy handwriting, signatures that don't match, and files marked confidential with no explanation. These aren't small mistakes. They look like major errors, maybe even cover-ups. One detective mutters, either they were careless or someone didn't want this case solved. It's the first time in 10 years the investigation feels alive again. The old paperwork doesn't just hold clues. It raises new questions, questions that point back at the department itself. As detectives keep digging, they find a separate folder buried in the back of a filing cabinet. It doesn't belong with the other missing person records. Inside are notes written in the sergeant's own handwriting. At first, it looks like a personal notebook, scribbled names, dates, and addresses. But when detectives read closer, they realize what it really is. The sergeant had been keeping quiet records of his own investigation. He wasn't just doing routine patrol work. He was digging into something dangerous, misconduct inside his own department. One page lists officers suspected of taking money on the side. Another page describes unusual traffic stops that weren't logged officially. There are notes about missing evidence, cash that disappeared from the evidence room, and reports that never reached court. It becomes clear the sergeant was building a case against people he worked with every day. He hadn't told his wife. He hadn't told his friends. He was keeping it secret, probably because he didn't know who he could trust. Detectives sit back in shock. This wasn't just a random disappearance. The sergeant may have vanished because he was getting too close to the truth. Detectives begin tracking down men who once wore the same badge. Some are long retired, living quiet lives far from the department. At first, they hesitate to talk. The silence feels heavy, like old wounds reopening. But slowly, details start to come out. One retired officer admits the sergeant had been digging where he shouldn't. He says the sergeant was asking too many questions, prying into files that weren't his. Another man, older now, goes even further. He remembers the sergeant meeting with him privately, worried about something bigger than routine police work. He said he was close to proving something, the man recalls, his voice shaking. Other interviews add pieces to the puzzle. The sergeant had been pushing into cases that others wanted buried, cases that involved officers themselves. Missing money, mishandled arrests, evidence that vanished before trial. What once sounded like wild rumor now begins to take shape. The missing sergeant wasn't just a cop who vanished one night. He may have been silenced. For detectives, it's a chilling realization. The enemy wasn't outside. The danger was inside the department all along. The science team works quietly, retesting everything found with the uniform. Soil samples taken from the dirt caked on the fabric are placed under powerful microscopes. The results come back with something surprising. The soil doesn't match the farm where the uniform was found. Instead, it matches a location several miles away, land once owned by a family tied to a former officer. Detectives pull old records and confirm it. The property belonged to the brother of a man who worked with the sergeant. That officer had retired soon after the disappearance, moving out of state. The discovery changes everything. This isn't just guesswork or rumor anymore. The science points directly inward. Detectives sit around a table, staring at the results. The uniform had been buried first at that property, then later moved to the farm where the farmer found it. Someone had gone to extreme lengths to hide it, but not well enough. It feels like proof. Someone connected to law enforcement had been involved. The question now is whether corruption played a role. The question is who exactly betrayed the sergeant and how far the cover-up went. Detectives sit with the files spread across the table. Every piece of evidence now points in one direction. The sergeant didn't walk away. He didn't get ambushed by strangers. He didn't vanish into thin air. He was silenced. The soil samples, the hidden notes, the retired officer's admissions, everything fits. The sergeant had been uncovering corruption inside his own department. He had gotten too close, and instead of protecting him, his own brothers in uniform turned against him. It's a bitter truth. Detectives realized that the patrol car left running on the side of the road wasn't just the start of a mystery, it was the start of a cover-up. The missing gun, the missing radio, the uniform buried in a field, it all paints a single picture. One or more officers didn't just betray their oath, they betrayed one of their own. The realization hangs in the air like smoke. For years, people had argued over theories, escape, revenge, or random crime. But the truth is far darker. The sergeant had trusted his department. That trust cost him his life. And the ones sworn to uphold justice may have been the very ones who buried it. When the findings reach the public, the town erupts. At first, there's disbelief. Neighbors shake their heads, refusing to accept that local officers could betray their own. But as reporters explain the soil samples, the hidden notes, and the testimonies, shock turns into outrage. People crowd into meetings, demanding answers. Some shout at city officials, accusing them of hiding the truth for years. Parents who once taught their kids to trust the police now warn them to be careful. The uniform, once a symbol of safety, suddenly feels tainted. The family of the missing sergeant is caught in the center. For them, the news is both relief and heartbreak. At last, there are answers. But the cost is unbearable. Their husband, their father, was likely betrayed by the very people he worked beside. The town will never look at the badge the same way again. For the sergeant's wife, the truth feels like a second loss. For years, she had held on to hope that maybe he walked away, maybe he was alive somewhere, maybe the mystery had a gentler answer. But now, all of that is gone. The reports confirm her greatest fear. The men her husband trusted most may have turned against him. She remembers the nights he came home quiet, the files he never shared, the worry in his eyes he never explained. Now she understands why. For the children, the betrayal is unbearable. Growing up without a father was already painful, but to learn that his own brothers in uniform may have been the cause, it's a wound that never fully heals. At school and in town, they hear the whispers. People say, "The cops killed their dad." The words follow them everywhere. The family once believed in the badge, believed in the oath their husband and father lived by. Now, that symbol feels broken. Every siren, every uniform is a reminder of what was taken from them. The truth doesn't bring peace. It brings a new kind of grief. Their hero didn't just vanish, he was betrayed. The day the arrests came, the town froze. News cameras captured images no one thought possible, police officers, still in uniform, being led away in handcuffs. The sight of badges and cuffs together didn't just shock the town. It sent ripples across the entire state. For decades, people had trusted these men to protect them. Now, those same men were accused of betraying one of their own. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, whispering, shouting, some even crying. The idea that officers could silence a fellow sergeant to protect themselves, it was almost too much to process. Reporters rushed to cover every detail. Headlines screamed words like corruption and betrayal. Commentators on TV asked the same question over and over: how deep does this go? Inside the department, morale collapsed. Officers who had nothing to do with the crime still carried the weight of suspicion. Every patrol car was looked at differently. Every badge seemed tarnished. For the sergeant's family, the arrests brought both relief and heartbreak. Finally, someone was being held responsible. But seeing the reality, trusted officers marched off in chains, was a wound all its own. Justice was coming, but it came with pain. The trials began with packed courtrooms. Families of the accused sat on one side. The sergeant's family sat on the other. Between them stood years of lies, silence, and now, truth finally exposed. Lawyers fought hard to control the story. The defense painted the sergeant as reckless, a man who had made enemies everywhere. They argued there was no proof tying their clients to his disappearance, just suspicion and soil samples. But prosecutors pushed back. They laid out the uniform, the badge, the forensic evidence. They replayed the statements of retired officers who admitted the sergeant was asking too many questions. Slowly, piece by piece, they built the picture of a cover-up. Some officers denied everything, their voices steady but cold. Others broke under pressure. Deals were made. One after another, men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder began to turn on each other, each hopping to save himself. For the jury, it was a maze of lies and half-truths. For the public, it was a painful theater, heroes unmasked as villains, the thin blue line cracking in plain sight. Justice was closer than ever, but the fight was far from over. In the courtroom, one item stole every eye: the ruined police uniform. laid carefully on a table, sealed in plastic. It was the single piece of undeniable truth. The sergeant's body was never found. There were no bones, no grave to point to. Only this uniform, unearthed from the dirt, told his story. Jurors studied it in silence. The frayed stitching, the torn fabric, the rusted badge still clinging to the chest, all of it screamed of violence, of a man taken too soon. Prosecutors pointed to it again and again. "This is not just clothing," they said. "This is proof of betrayal." The defense tried to argue it wasn't enough. No body meant no murder, they claimed. Maybe the sergeant really had disappeared and someone buried the uniform later, but those words rang hollow. The public had already made up its mind. To the community, the uniform became a symbol. It was the one thing that could not lie. In a sea of rumors, cover-ups, and silence, it stood as the anchor of truth. The man was gone, but his uniform had risen from the ground to speak for him. For the sergeant's wife and children, the hearings were brutal. They sat through hours of testimony, hearing strangers dissect the life of the man they loved. Every word cut deep. Every theory, every denial, every excuse. It all reopened wounds that had never healed. When officers were finally found guilty, the family felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, yes, because answers had come at last, but also anger. Why had it taken a decade? Why had they been left alone for so many years while the truth sat buried? The wife clutched the badge, now rusted and worn as if it were her husband's hand. To her, it was the closest thing she would ever have to a goodbye. For the children, now older, the case gave them facts, but not comfort. They had grown up in whispers, shadows, and pain. No verdict could give back the father they lost. Reporters asked them if they felt justice was served. The wife's answer was quiet but firm. Justice came late, too late, and it will never bring him home. The relief was real, but the grief stayed heavier than ever. When the verdicts came down, the town split apart. On one side were neighbors who still defended the department. They said a few bad officers didn't mean the whole force was corrupt. They argued that justice had already been done and people needed to move on. But others could not forget. To them, the betrayal cut too deep. They demanded reform, stronger oversight, and leaders who could guarantee this would never happen again. In city meetings, tempers flared. Some shouted that the badge was sacred. Others shouted back that the badge had been used to bury one of their own. Families who had lived side by side for decades suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of the argument. Trust, once easy in a small community, was shattered. Police tried to reassure the public, promising change. But many townspeople no longer believed. Every siren that passed brought suspicion. Every officer on patrol faced silent stares from people who once waved in respect. The department had lost more than just a case. It had lost its bond with the people it swore to protect, and that wound would not heal quickly. Through all the anger, one thing remained constant: the memory of the missing sergeant. Despite the betrayal, his name rose higher than the scandal. He was remembered as a man who stood for integrity, even when it cost him everything. The town held memorials in his honor. A statue was placed near the courthouse, his name carved into stone. People left flowers, notes, and pictures. His children stood by quietly, seeing strangers honor the father they lost. Schools began to tell his story as a lesson about duty and courage. Teachers reminded students that standing for what is right may come with a heavy price, but it mattered. For the family, these moments were bittersweet. They felt proud, but also hollow. Pride could not replace the years stolen from them. Still, the memorials gave them something they had not felt in years: the sense that their husband and father had not been forgotten. To the wider community, he became more than a victim. He became a symbol, a reminder that courage lives on, even when silence tries to bury it. His uniform had been dug up from the dirt, but his legacy now stood tall in the light. In the end, the uniform dug from the dirt was more than just fabric. It was proof that silence, fear, and misplaced loyalty can bury the truth deeper than any grave. For years, the sergeant's disappearance had been blamed on chance, on criminals, on bad luck. But the evidence told another story. The danger hadn't come from outside the badge. It had come from within. That realization left a scar not just on the department, but on the town itself. Because if the people sworn to protect could betray one of their own, then where did safety truly lie? Retired officers admitted that whispers had followed the sergeant for years. They said he was asking too many questions. They said he was digging where he shouldn't. And in the end, those questions became his undoing. His pursuit of truth had been met not with honor but with silence, then burial. The haunting part wasn't only the betrayal. It was the delay. 10 years passed before the uniform surfaced, before the truth clawed its way out of the dirt. 10 years where his wife cried alone at night, where his children grew up with no answers, where justice was nothing more than a cruel rumor. Justice delayed is never justice served. And in this story, the delay was as much a crime as the act itself. Today, the sergeant's name stands as both a warning and a reminder. A warning that loyalty can be twisted, that silence can be deadly, and that sometimes the real threat doesn't wear a mask, it wears a badge. The lesson is chilling, unforgettable, and clear. When justice sleeps, corruption thrives.